Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
China is an economic rival to the United States, and tensions are high between the two countries. China also has a robust space program, at least from outward appearances. They've launched and manned the Tiangong space station and have been cooperating with Russia in space. What does all this mean for space commerce? In this second of a three-part series, we talk again with global security consultant Namrata Goswami for her insights. Namrata, welcome back to the Terra podcast.
Thank you, Tom, for having me. It's my pleasure.
So let's talk first of all about kind of the basics. What is the current state of China's economy?
Yeah, it's a great place to start. So if you look at the International Monetary Fund statistics, they have said that this year, which is 2023, China would have a gross domestic product growth rate of about 5.4%. But Barclays has downgraded it from their forecast of 4.9% to about 4.2% this year. The Chinese Communist Party has also given us statistics where they point out that they believe their growth rate will be about 5.4%. And the critical importance is that in the first quarter of 2023, China had actually one of the best growth rates in the last few years after post-COVID recovery. So they had a growth rate of about 4.2%, which grew up from about 2.9% before that. So having said all that, the Chinese economy today is about $18 trillion. But interestingly, in the last few months, we have seen that there has been concern in terms of whether this will continue, whether the economy will continue to be stable because of fluctuating real estate prices, the fact that their infrastructure builders have not been able to get buyers for their houses. They're suffering from inflation, as well as consumers are not spending as much. So that has an impact on how the economy is going to move forward. But as of now, when you look at how Chinese banks are performing vis-a-vis the fact that they have all these concerns, in the last few months, Chinese banks, their bonds have actually recovered to an extent, about 2% recovery. They seem to be stable as of now, but then we'll have to wait and see how that looks in the next few months.
You know, I heard that about Chinese real estate in particular, that they're kind of facing almost a worse housing crisis than we saw here in the U.S. in 2008. Is that kind of your assessment as well?
Yeah, because if you look at the data that has been put out by several banks, including international banks, they are having a crisis in terms of concern that their very upward housing market is going to burst. And the concern is that financial conglomerates are defaulting on paying their interest rates. Secondly, as I said before, the one way the Chinese housing market did very well is that when the development companies build their homes, they would get buyers even before the houses were built. They're not getting that anymore. It seems like the Chinese consumer, people who buy property, are tending to save more and not spending as much. So they are going towards a crisis. And that kind of crisis has impact, as you know, which has trickle-down effect. For example, the prices of iron ore, because steel is a very critical component of China's manufacturing and plays a really important part in terms of building. So it is true to an extent that they are having a housing market crisis. Having said that, we'll have to wait and see whether it's going to burst or create issues as we saw in 2008 in the United States.
Give me something of a comparison, because when you talk about China, you don't think of them as being a consumer economy. They're a command economy, but you keep talking about people aren't spending as much. They're not consuming the way they used to. How does that all kind of justify itself?
So China actually has one of the biggest domestic markets for consumption. So when you think about the market today, China is one of the biggest importer of raw material, for example, iron ore, which they use for their developments, a big importer of luxury goods, including the luxury brands that we have, Nike, for example, Gucci. So they're very much a consumer economy. They tend to invest and buy a lot in terms of electronics goods. But having said that, what is happening today is that China is starting to decrease their import of, for example, cars from Japan, chips from Japan. They have decreased their import of chips from Taiwan. The biggest concern in Asia is that given the weakness of the Chinese economy, many Asian countries are big importers, exporters of their finished products to China, and China has a big market for that. And so we see a slump in all that. And Africa is also supporting Africa is supporting that kind of consumerism. But in the last few years, and especially this year, there has been a 14% decrease of exported goods from Africa and Asia to China because of the fact that there has been this slow inflation indexes. There has been a lot of saving. And just to answer your question, why is it that Chinese consumers are saving more? I think COVID-19 was a wake-up call. China does not have the kind of social security we have in the United States. In fact, President Xi is against stimulus and welfareism. And so the Chinese citizen is tending to save more and not consuming as much as they did before COVID-19. So China is actually a big consumer, one of the largest consumer markets in the world.
When you look at the Chinese economy over the next few years, is it possible to identify some of the specific challenges that is facing Chinese economy in the next 5 years or so?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges comes from the Communist Party of China itself. So first of all, they do not believe in slow or short-term growth. So they are pushing for more long-term, high-quality growth. And that can have an impact on how the Chinese economy is conceived today. Second, the fact that their currency has, it goes ups and downs, is not stable. That's a big concern. The third biggest challenge, I think, if you think of a rational analysis of a market or an economy, is the fact that under President Xi Jinping, a lot of people who had technical know-how of market analysis, stock exchange, what needs to be done to keep the prices stable. For example, the import of iron ore, which has a big impact on global prices as well. That kind of meritocracy-based expertise has been challenged because under President Xi Jinping, a lot of loyalists, people who are loyal to the Communist Party of China, who would have rational analysis, is missing. So by that I mean, when you have loyalists, you would have an analysis that showcases the Communist Party of China as winning, vis-a-vis any other data that might not be flattering. For example, before this happened, China would discuss and debate their economy. They would talk about the high rates of unemployment and aging population, concerns about environmentalism, concerns about the fact that the export-import balance could not be in China's favor. But today, that kind of data is not put out or discouraged. And so I think those are the biggest challenges. An economy that does not recognize its own challenges because of this blindness to loyalty is one of the biggest challenges, I think, for China.
So then what's the overall effect on the global economy?
I think for the global economy, anything that happens in China will have a deep impact. If you think about the economy today, especially after the end of the Cold War, it is extremely interdependent. The world depends on Chinese exports. We all buy Chinese exports, for example, in Walmart, basic necessities of life, rare earth, which is a critical component that China dominates. China is one of the biggest manufacturers of solar panels, the world's largest producer of steel. So that itself has a big impact if things don't go right in those regard. The more important thing is China, as I mentioned before, is a big consumer of world products. And so if the Chinese economy doesn't do well, that means that countries that import to China, electronics goods, cars, luxury items, clothes, retail, soybean. China is one of the biggest importer of soybean, including from the United States. That has a big impact on the world because then the demand for import to China would actually go down. And so that has a ripple effect across the world as well.
China's aggressive behavior towards its neighbors has increased. So what have they done, and does this increase the likelihood of war, particularly over Taiwan?
So the Taiwan situation is extremely critical, and actually it is connected to your questions about China's economy per se as well. So one of the biggest reasons why Taiwan is such a strategic asset for the world is because Taiwan manufactures and is the world leader in semiconductors. So the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company is the largest producer of that particular capability. And as you know, we use it in our iPhones, we use it in our cars, we use it in our weapon system. So having said that, anything that would happen to Taiwan would impact that semiconductor supply chain. And so, as you know, the United States took a decision last year passing a chip manufacturing bill of $280 billion to encourage domestic production and bring in export control. So that particular economic implication needs to be kept in mind when we think about Taiwan. So in the Chinese conception, they have a one China principle, which is different from the one China policy of the United States. People always equate both. They cannot be equated. So in the one China principle, Taiwan belongs to China, is a rogue province, has historically been a Chinese province, and under the Communist Party of China, they are willing to use force to actually bring about the reintegration of Taiwan to the mainland. And so to forward this particular strategy, President Xi in 2019 gave a speech in which he said that one of the biggest critical components of the China dream is to reintegrate Taiwan by all means by 2049, which is the 100-year celebration of the People's Republic of China. So now in terms of operation to meet that strategic goal, China has actually increased its flights, for example, bombers, fighter pilots into Taiwan's sphere of influence, including its air. It has started patrolling the Taiwan Straits with their aircraft carrier and other naval vessels to showcase power. And this has actually increased in the last few years. Now, the reason why this has happened is because today we have the Democratic Progressive Party, which is led by President Xi, who is in favor of independence of Taiwan. And she basically does not agree with her predecessor, President Ma, from the Kuomintang, who believed in increasing China-Taiwan Strait relation, including the economic relationship. And there is a 1992 consensus between both that is misunderstood by both sides, actually. From the Taiwan perspective, China, Mongolia, Tibet, South China Sea are part of the Republic of Taiwan. And in the Chinese conception, it is Taiwan who is actually part of China. So there is that particular angle as well. Now, whether they will go to war, that's a very critical question to think about. If I think about, say, escalation of violence, say, in the next 5 years, that has deep impact for geopolitics, including for space. So this would mean that China would utilize force and would reintegrate Taiwan by force. And that would have economic repercussion for Taiwan as well. So not many people realize, but China is the biggest economic partner for Taiwan. And so that would have impact on Taiwan itself, including the cutting off any kind of import from Taiwan of electronics. The United States would also, based on the 6 assurances, might come to the support of Taiwan. So under the current relationship, the US is not treaty obligated to come to the defense of Taiwan, but maintains a very high level of diplomatic and military relationship. And according to the 6 assurances that President Ronald Reagan put out in 1982, the US will decide to come to the defense of Taiwan in case there is an escalation of conflict. And President Biden has repeated that in some of his press conferences. So the likelihood of war, in my estimation, is high, given the fact that President Xi wants to have that particular reintegration and has talked about utilizing force as the last resort as well.
Are there any specific threats to Xi Jinping's political power in China? Has he lost the mandate of heaven?
If I look at the, so for that, to answer your question, you have to look at how do you define power in China. It might not be the same as how do you define representation and credibility, for example, in the country we live in, which is the United States, is a democratic nation.
Mhm.
So in the US, president's legitimacy, so-called democratic mandate is dependent on whether he wins an election, first of all, second, the polls and policies. And there is always the possibility of not winning an election because a US president, as you know, can run for 2 terms. So unlike that particular democratic, matrix of what do you mean when you talk about legitimacy and credibility in the Chinese context for President Xi Jinping, the biggest credibility and the mandate of heaven comes from support of the Communist Party of China. And I say this with seriousness because the only entity that can dethrone him and go against him is the CCP. And the CCP is a major one-party system with about 95 million hardcore members and millions of sympathizers. And so if he loses that particular support, that's when he loses the mandate of heaven. It is not when we think that he might have lost the support of the Chinese people, because it doesn't work that way. He's not elected. He's not a democratically elected leader. So in my conceptualization, if I look at the matrix of power within China, he actually has been able to consolidate power. He has talked about the integration of the civil military sectors of China. He has instituted a civil military fusion. He's published several of his ideas, which are called the communism with Chinese or socialism with Chinese characteristics. He has made loyalty to the party the most important factor, including from the military. And unlike Hu Jintao, he became the General Secretary of the Communist Party of China, the President of the People's Republic of China, and the Chairman of the Chinese Central Military Commission at one go. So you can see that there is consolidation of power. So, and secondly, what is fascinating is that despite the economic crisis that China is facing today, if you look at President Xi's conversations, it's about resilience, society being able to navigate this difficult time. And again, what is missed in the West is that how they are projecting it is that China has a huge civilizational history where they have had several periods of destabilization, downturns, including the century of humiliation. This period is just 2 years. It's nothing compared to the civilizational instability they faced. And the argument given by him is that the Chinese Communist Party is the only party that has been able to give China a glorious wealth generation, food on the table, lifted millions of people of poverty. And so that's the discourse people are hearing. So he's talking about resilience and ability. Having said that, I would say that if you look at his zero COVID-19 tolerance policy, you saw that there were protests against it, including the lockdown. So not everything would be smooth. There would be protests against hardcore CCP policies for economic resilience, interest rates, but that wouldn't mean that he has lost the mandate of heaven.
I'm talking with global security consultant Dr. Namrata Goswami on the Terra podcast. Take a moment right now to click subscribe to be sure you don't miss any of our podcasts, or if you're watching on YouTube, any of the videos from Terra, the Journal of Space Commerce. Let's turn this now to space commerce, Namrata. So what are some of China's recent space achievements?
So some of China's recent space achievements in the last 5 years is that it was the first country to successfully land a robotic mission on the lunar far side, the Chang'e 4. It was able to launch the Chang'e 5 subsequent mission to the moon. And that mission was actually extremely important, both from a civil and military perspective. So from a civil perspective, the Chang'e 5 was the first mission that showcased autonomous landing, autonomous docking in orbit, autonomous collection of lunar samples, returning it back to the orbiter and then sending it back to Earth with hypersonic capability. And then what was interesting was that the Chang'e 5 then, once it returned the samples, went to the Sun-Earth Lagrange point 1. So those are amazing demonstration of space capability. The second important capability that China has showcased is the relay satellite in Earth Moon Lagrange point 2, the only country to have such a capability. So which means that they can communicate from the far side to the ground stations on Earth with the help of Magpie Bridge. And they are launching a second relay satellite next year. In 2022, which is last year, China successfully completed the construction of their Tiangong space station, the only nation to have a completely independent one nation space station. We have the International Space Station as a collaboration among several countries. And then what is interesting is that they have also been able to demonstrate the supply chain with lowering of costs. So they have built the Tiangzhou cargo spacecraft that sends cargoes to the Tiangong space station, and also they have increased the ability to sustain humans in low Earth orbit. They launch their taikonauts to their Tiangong space station from 3 months to 6 months. So again, those are interesting demonstrations of capability. And then finally, what is interesting to me is that China has also showcased an ability to test interesting experiments in space. One was the experiment of mouse embryos that successfully survived in space for about 90 days, if I remember. They launched that in 2016. And then the other experiment that they launched was a bio lab to the moon through the Chang'e 4, where they showcased to us that a seed like potato or Arabidopsis could actually survive on the moon. It didn't survive the lunar night. It was an experiment to see whether it would actually sprout, and they successfully did that. So these are some of the achievements that China has showcased to the world in the last few years.
So what's the status then of China's current partnership with Russia on space projects?
So in terms of the current relationship with Russia, China has signed, as I mentioned in my podcast before with you, an agreement to develop a lunar industrial facility by 2036. And I use the word industrial because if you look at the conceptions that are coming up from the Chinese lead lunar scientists, they're not viewing this as just a research station to study and explore and do scientific missions. They're seeing it from a very commercial perspective, and they have successfully demonstrated several missions before that. So the idea is that by 2027, China will be testing the Long March 10, which is their rocket that will launch their lunar landers, which will take humans to the moon. By 2030, in collaboration with Russia, they want to study the south pole of the moon, where the resources are, to see where they can both establish their research base. And by 2036, both countries want to successfully build that particular base. The second agreement that China and Russia have signed is in the 2021 China White Paper, in which they have both agreed to develop technology for planetary defense. So, which is a very interesting collaboration because it is about developing a technology that can actually scan space for asteroid threats, given the fact that the dinosaurs, as you know, died because of meteor and asteroid hits 65 million years ago. And so they argue that this is going to be a global good and they want to develop it together. But as you know, there are military implications of such technology because a technology that can deflect an asteroid coming at such speed can also deflect satellites and other systems that the US or signatory nations to US partnerships might have. So that's what China and Russia are looking at in terms of their future program. Finally, this is not what they have agreed to, but this is my forecast based on what I've heard from both China and Russia, is that Russia might exit the US led International Space Station in the next 5 years. And for their own economic and technological capability building, join China in the Tiangong space station. So that could happen as well.
But then how does a poor economy in Russia and potentially in China affect China's space ambitions?
So if you look at China's budgeting for space, those are agreed upon several years ago. So for example, if you look at their investment in their space capability or space building, is about 12 billion based on open source data. And we do not know how much they're actually spending on their military space program. China does not publish a budget. not for space, not for their military. And so, as we know, the Chinese space program is led by the People's Liberation Army, and many of the People's Liberation Army units and technocrats and scientists are embedded in their space program, including those from the People's Liberation Army Strategic Support Force that China established in 2015. So one way that the space program is not going to be impacted by China's economic problem is because that budget for the program has already been financed and already been agreed to, and they've already put forward the funds. So let me give you an example specifically. So their lunar missions that are actually planned out till 2036 and beyond, the funding for it started around 2002. So what you're seeing today is not sudden development of technology.
Mhm.
The decisions to invest in a lunar far-side mission, the Chang'e 4, on a lunar sample return mission, on a lunar South Pole mission, these decisions were taken in 2002, 2003. The budgets were allocated, and they are continuing the development of the capability. China's Mars mission, the investment for that particular mission started in 2006. And then finally, China's Tiangong space station, the budget for it was allocated around 2010. And now they're building a national satellite constellation, the budget for which was allocated in their 5-year plans, which started about 4 years ago. So I do not see the space program suffering from a lack of budget because of the problems that China's economy is facing today, because of those long-term investment and cycles. They're not dependent on every year debating and deciding whether you need to fund these programs. It's a long-term investment.
Much like we talked about last time with Russia, is there a private space sector that could take root in China? Could there be an Elon Musk there? Or is it much the same situation that they have in Russia where it's all controlled by the government?
So China is a very different story compared to Russia. So just to remind your audience, as I spoke in the last podcast, Russia has not taken a decision to support or to build policy that encourages investment from their private space sector. It's a very centralized system. And also Roscosmos has its own anxieties. Compared to that, what is so fascinating about China, and this you can see in other technology buildup as well. For example, China is now encouraging Huawei to build semiconductors and investing heavily through their innovation policy in building that capacity. We'll have to wait and see whether they succeed, but they are starting. So you can make very similar comparisons with their space policy with regard to commercialization. So in 2014, the State Council, which is China's highest decision-making body, took a decision that they are going to encourage the private development of space and allocate funds, spaceports to launch those systems at very sustainable and subsidized rates. And at that time, the funding that was allocated was about $2 billion. Today, it has scaled up to about 7 billion, according to open source data again, which is a quite high escalation of capability. Now, because of that particular policy decision that China took, it's called Document 60. It's available on the internet if your readers or your audience is interested in looking at it. And so today, China has about 140 commercial space startups. Several of them have already launched to orbit. One Space has launched to orbit. Link Space is building a reusable spacecraft. Galaxy Space is building a satellite internet constellation, which will support 5G capability. And now what they're talking about is that they're also going to build a commercial spaceport. China already has 2 very important spaceports, plus another one they're building. And so the final one that they're building is going to be completely commercial for the purposes of the development of a commercial spaceport. And so you can see that China, fast forward, China will play a very critical role when it comes to the commercialization of space because of these policy incentives, very similar to what India's done this year with a space policy that supports commercialization of space. Now, the critical question is whether they will be able to have an Elon Musk, an entrepreneur with risk-taking, also building very capable technology like reusable rockets. So when it comes to technology and when it comes to the model, it is still similar to Russia. It does still have state-owned institutions like the China Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation that dominates, the China Academy of Space Technology that dominates again. If you look at their decision to build reusable rockets while they're supporting iSpace, the Chinese iSpace, to build the Hyperbola, which is a reusable rocket, they also are building their own reusable capability with the Long March 9. So last year, China took a decision to turn their heavy lift rocket, which is able to take about 140 metric tons to low Earth orbit, similar to Starship, into a reusable rocket by 2030. So they still have a lot of state-funded and state-owned institutions crafting policy and maintaining and determining the direction of commercialization of space. In 2021, the China National People's Congress passed a law that makes it mandatory for any space startup to contribute to the national defense. And if they don't, they can be criminally charged. So in that particular environment, can an Elon Musk-like entrepreneur, make extremely credible and extremely influential space technology? I doubt it, because you saw what happened to Jack Ma of Alibaba. The moment he deviated from the Communist Party of China narrative, he faced extreme amounts of coercion and pressure. So it will not be one individual. It might be a commercial space startup like iSpace, making it big, or Link Space or Land Space. There are others as well, but you will not have an individual person getting that kind of focus, because ultimately, the only entity that matters in terms of legitimacy and loyalty and credibility is the Communist Party of China and the leaders that are of the CCP. So a private individual will not have the kind of meteoric rise that Elon Musk had.
We're just about out of time, Namrata, but I want you to look out again over the next 10 to 15 years in space commerce and the role that China will play. Will they be able to play a role in space commerce, or is it going to continue to be far more of a government-driven situation?
So as the way the Chinese economic model runs is that they will play a critical role when it comes to space commerce. In the next 10 years, we will have Chinese national satellite constellations that are supported by private space startups, including 5G supported constellations. They will probably develop their own commercial space station. They will build satellite internet, which they have made critical infrastructure that will be supported by private entities. But it will be a collaboration between state-owned institutions who will lead the policy and the direction and the funding. And you will have private entities that will draw foreign direct investment. China is one of the biggest, markets for foreign direct investments. And it'll also depend on their ability to build this technology at cheaper rates. So the way we are seeing the world unfold today, there is a push for sustainable space development. There is a push for bringing down cost of launch. We know Starship is trying to do that. India has a very economical space program, and so does China. So given that China will play a critical role, as it is playing with other sectors of the economy in the space commercialization as well. And what is important is that they've actually taken an official decision, unlike Russia, to support the commercialization of space through their Document 60. So I see them playing a role in space commerce in the future.
Dr. Goswami, we are out of time, but thank you so much. And of course, next time we'll talk about India, which had a really significant win in the last couple of weeks with a landing on the moon. So that's going to be an interesting conversation. I look forward to it.
Thank you for having me. I look forward to it as well.
Dr. Namrata Goswami is a global security consultant. And that's going to do it for this edition of the Terra podcast. You can subscribe to the audio version of the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Audible, and many other popular podcasting platforms. Be sure to click on subscribe so you don't miss an episode of the podcast or any of our other videos. You can also get daily space commerce news at xterrajsc.com. And one thing more, be sure to connect with us on LinkedIn and follow us on X at xterrajsc. Until next time, I'm Tom Patton. Thanks for joining us.
I wanna go faster, faster. Hands in the air, we're gonna crash. Searching for the answers, my Galileo through his looking glass. Thirst for reason. Our dreamer's eyes we gaze into a sense of purpose, know my view. Like finding water on the moon.